When people talk about writing, typically plot, characterization, and theme are the principles that come up. There is, however, a fourth concept that's just as important: point of view. When and how we use it can have a powerful impact on our stories. It can turn something humdrum into something nail-biting. It can change everything. Hi, my name is Jonathan Oldenburg, author of Tears from Iron, a fantasy epic set in a world racked by cataclysm, where only one civilization still stands out against the darkness that threatens to overwhelm everything. It is a realm of ancient beings called Siristari, along with their human servants, and the main protagonist is a human warrior defending that civilization, who has to infiltrate various wild tribes in order to try to find a way to preserve the last peoples. Okay, so let's talk about point of view. And as we get started, I want to be clear. I don't want to mislead you up front. We are going to be talking almost exclusively about the third person limited perspective. I will touch briefly on the others at the beginning, but if you were looking at a deep dive into first person or something along those lines, this video probably won't be covering the topics you're looking for. However, most books are written in third person limited point of view for a reason, and so I suspect that for most viewers this will be helpful and hopefully an interesting conversation. This conversation also was the inspiration actually for my previous video on plot threads. And so if you are interested in learning more about that, as the two do sort of interrelate, go ahead and check that out. I'll have it linked in the description below. So as we get started, let me rephrase my introductory premise in a different way. Plot, character, and theme is the story. Point of view is how that story is told. And this can have a huge impact. As an example, imagine if the Fellowship of the Ring was told from the perspective of Boromir rather than the perspective of Frodo. Instead of a young hobbit who's never been far from home, who enjoys the comforts of life, suddenly thrust out onto a dangerous road carrying the heaviest burden possible, you now have a grizzled warrior, a veteran of many battles in a war that began long before he was born, in a desperate plight, seeking out the solution that will preserve the lives of not only his kingdom, but all the peoples of the world. And on this journey, the very hope he's looking for becomes a temptation, and his journey becomes darker and darker as he begins to see and believe that his possession of it is the only way to bring about the end he desires. And ultimately, he gives in to that temptation. Can you imagine a tale told from that perspective? It would be epic, but it would also be incredibly different from the Fellowship of the Ring that we know and love. This is the power of point of view. There are two major points of view, first and third person, and I don't want to spend a lot of time going into a deep discussion of these, but I do want to touch on them very briefly. So with first person, there are two styles that are common. The first is the past tense, which is the far more common style, wherein we have a narrator who is recounting events that occurred to them at some point in the past. The second method of the first person point of view is the present tense, and this is far less common and is far more difficult both to write and sometimes even to read. It can, however, be done very successfully, as is exemplified by the popular series The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. Third person also has two styles. The first of these is the omniscient point of view, wherein you have a all-seeing, all-knowing narrator as well, but this narrator is not a single person, but rather somebody outside of the story who has the ability to jump into different perspectives at any point in time in order to tell the best story possible. The other third person point of view, which is the main topic, as I mentioned before, of this video, is the third person limited point of view. This is once again third person, but we are limited to only being in one point of view for a distinctive period of time, which is carefully demarked. I'm not going to dive into a lot of depth about the main advantages and disadvantages of these perspectives, although a little bit will come up as we go through the tips. If you want a deeper dive from me, let me know in the comments. I think these are fairly familiar to most of my viewers, but I'm not 100% sure. Alternatively, Orson Scott Card does an excellent review of point of view as part of his Characters and Viewpoint book. Most of the book is about character, but at the end he does go into the basics, advantages and disadvantages of each methodology. However, most of the tips I'll be covering today are not mentioned in his book. First, why is the limited point of view such a popular and common methodology? And I think it's because it's the most versatile. It can offer the same level of intensity that you can get from the first person, where you can be really close in on the action because you're staying with one person at any distinct point in time, but it also doesn't have the limitations. For example, with the first person past tense, there is a distance between when those events happened for the narrator and when the reader is reading about them, which makes certain things impossible. For example, that character has to survive to tell the story to the reader. On the other hand, in the third person limited, the point of view that we are watching a story from, that person could die. In fact, we could be with them as they die, and the story can go on because the narrative simply can jump to a different perspective. And so that is a level of versatility you get in third person that first person doesn't have. Additionally, the third person limited is the only perspective that does not require a narrator. All of the other ones have to have somebody telling the story to the reader. Whereas in third person, you are actually living the experience with that character. You are not the character, as in first person, but you are right beside them, seeing what they see, feeling what they feel, being with them throughout. And so there is not that need for a narrator to translate the events for you. And I think probably the third reason for the great popularity is simply that of popularity breeds popularity. This is a style of writing that has been around for a very long time, has become very familiar to readers, and so it does not ask a lot of readers to engage with it, to understand it, to immerse themselves into it. Whereas some of the other perspectives, for example, first person present tense, can be so jarring that sometimes the reader may actually lose the immersion that you're seeking. So let's get into the tips. Tip number one. This is probably a very obvious tip, but I think it bears repeating as it's sort of foundational to all the other concepts that we're going to be talking about. And that is the basic principle of a third person limited point of view is that if you are going to change perspectives, hop heads, if you will, you need to carefully demark when that happens. Unlike the omniscient point of view where you can jump back and forth, in a limited perspective, you are telling the reader that I am going to spend either this entire section of the novel or this entire chapter of the novel with this one character. And when we leave that character for another, I will lay that out for you. And this typically is done as a writer by having section breaks marked by 3 asterisks. Now, when that goes to publishing and you give it to a layout artist, they may get rid of those 3 asterisks and simply have an extra space, or they may find another method of marking those. I was really pleased with the layout artist for Tears from Iron. She put this really cool stylized line which marked the change in perspective. But the point is, you have to be very clear when you're jumping those points of view. If you're not clear and you do it willy-nilly, you're not actually writing a third-person limited view novel, you're actually writing an omniscient novel, whether you intended to or not. Okay, tip number 2, and that is if you're going to hop heads, that is, change perspectives at various points in the novel, because you don't have to, I'll get into that in a moment. But if you plan to, then I strongly recommend beginning to establish this pattern early on. You don't have to do it in the first chapter or the second chapter, but probably by the third chapter, once you're 10,000, 15,000 words into your story, by that point in time, you really should have more than one perspective. I think it's fairly common in novels, I know it's common in mine, to spend the first few chapters with our protagonist, seeing the world from their point of view. And this, I think, oftentimes can help the immersion of the reader to understand the world, to understand the character, and understand kind of how the story begins, so we can see how the circumstances change and the conflicts arise that they have to grapple with. And that can be very helpful. Not required, but helpful. But if you're going to do that, don't hold off for too long before jumping to a second perspective, because this sort of comes down to another form of an authorial promise. A lot of them, as an example of point of view, aren't so much a promise of the narrative you're going to be telling, but the methodology in which you're telling the story. And so by having that point of view switch early on, you're letting the reader know, hey, I'm going to be spending different times in different people's point of view, and that way they can get comfortable with it. Whereas, in contrast, if you wait until the climax, where through the first several acts of the book, you've been entirely from the protagonist's point of view, and then at that very end, you jump to the antagonist, for example, that can be incredibly jarring and will throw your reader out of the story at the very moment when you want them most immersed. So that's why it's important to establish this idea early on. And you don't have to spend a lot of time with those other characters, just some time, enough to establish that that's what you will be doing periodically. This does bring up 2 variants, though. And this is just because in the third person limited point of view, you can jump into different points of view, doesn't mean you have to. You can actually spend the entire book with just one perspective. Probably the protagonist, but not necessarily. The cool thing about this is essentially you're telling a first-person story in the third-person style, which removes that distance that I mentioned earlier on and can have really powerful effects and can make for a very, very great story. Because the protagonist isn't telling you the story as a narrative, you can even get more immersed into what's going on. It feels immediate. On the other hand, you could write the entire book without ever going into the perspective of your protagonist. Instead, you could have it from the point of view of one or more of these secondary characters who are existing alongside that protagonist, and the reader gets to experience their perspectives, their thoughts, their emotions as they see what their protagonist is doing. I tried doing some Google searches to come up with an example I could give you of real books, and I failed. I was not able to find one. I imagine they exist. They certainly could exist. The closest I could come up with are some first-person perspective books written outside of the protagonist's point of view. And the two of those that I think are probably most famous are Watson telling the story of Sherlock Holmes and Nick Carraway telling the story in The Great Gatsby. The third tip is that when you are in a character's point of view, don't withhold information that that character has from the reader. The reader is with that character, seeing and being with that individual as they are interacting and interpreting the world. Therefore, if that character interprets something, the reader should see it as well. Obviously, you don't have to tell everything. When we first meet a character inside of their own head, we don't have to be given the entire backstory from the day they were born until the present moment with all of their thoughts and feelings on their life, on the world, on everything. We don't need that. What we need is what they are experiencing now. To be fair, when a reader first experiences a new point of view, it probably is a good idea to allow for a certain introduction to some core thoughts or ideas to make them familiar with their agenda, their motives, their frame of mind. But that can be done in a sentence or so. Some cases it probably can be skipped. But the main point here isn't so much the backstory or the frame of mind of a point of view character, but rather what they are experiencing right now. Say, for example, the character whose point of view you're currently in comes across a six-legged, four-armed, purple creature called a Who's a What's It. The character knows it's called a Who's a What's It. Because the character knows that, the character needs to identify it as a Who's a What's It and let the reader know that it's a Who's a What's It. You are literally inside the character's head in the moment that they are recognizing and identifying this creature. You can't keep that a secret. To flip it on its head, as another example, let's say the point of view character that you are currently in comes across a creature that they know is called a blobbity blah. You can't just say that Bob sees a blobbity blah. You have to describe it for the reader. Not only is this point of view character identifying this creature, he's also seeing it. He is seeing the fact that this blobbity blah is in fact a 10-foot, gray-skinned, tusked monstrosity. And so you have to tell the reader that the blobbity blah is a gray-skinned, 10-foot, tusked monstrosity. One of the great widespread aggravations of Stephen Erickson's Malazan Book of the Fallen is that he constantly breaks this concept. He's a skilled author telling very good stories, but he likes to not share what is obvious to the people of his world in order to be clever, I guess. It's not clever. It's not mysterious. It's obnoxious and stubborn, will tick off your readers. Don't do it. So what do you do if you want to keep the name of the Who's a What's It a secret for a while? Maybe this is some mythical creature that has some deeper meaning that you want to draw out the suspension for. How can you do that? Well, the solution there is simply to have the encounter with this Who's a What's It to be from the perspective of a character that doesn't know what it is. So that way the character can go, oh, it's the, was it six-legged, purple, four-armed creature, but I don't know what it is. Because that character doesn't know what it is, it's okay for the character not to tell the reader what it is because they can't share the information that they don't have themselves. And so that's a technique that can really work if you want to veil something for a time. Hey there, this is Jonathan from The Edit, and wouldn't you know it, between shooting this video and posting it on YouTube, I've come across two circumstances where I may have failed to follow through with my own recommendation. Rather than be a hypocrite, I wanted to cut in here and talk it through. So I'm currently working on the sequel to Tears from Iron, and I'm in the stage where I'm doing revising and polishing. So in one of the scenes, which is from the protagonist's point of view, he comes across something that he knows and recognizes. I'm going to do some substitution to avoid spoilers. So we'll say that what he comes across is a whatchamacallit. He's never come across one before, but they've been described in sufficient detail that it's obvious that's what he's looking at. Nevertheless, I don't immediately identify it. Why not? Now, before I answer that, I do want to say that I eventually do provide the proper name for what it is that he's seeing. It takes about 1 page or 500 words, and so I do get there, but I don't immediately. That's one point here. I'm adding a little bit of suspense. I'm drawing things out a little bit, sort of like a magician pulling a rabbit out of the hat. I'm building up to that reveal. This also gives the readers a few moments to see if they can identify the whatchamacallit. There have been a few clues for the reader as well where they may be able to piece it together and have the pleasure of saying, haha, I know what it is, before the book actually tells him what it is. Sure, this isn't a mystery whodunit, but there still can be opportunities for readers to reach those conclusions and have that satisfaction of finding the answer. Another reason why this delay works has to do with the protagonist's state of mind. He is in a highly charged, very tense situation where his mind is processing many different things at the same time, and therefore he's not going to step back and look at this whatchamacallit from an analytical point of view going, I know all these other important things are vying for my attention, but let's do some analysis here and deduce all this together and come up with, oh, that's a whatchamacallit. It just doesn't have to happen that way. Eventually, he will tease it out and have the big reveal both for himself and for the reader, but it doesn't have to happen in that first split second when he sees what he is seeing. And that's the point here. Much like I talked about avoiding reveals by jumping to a different point of view that doesn't have the information, you can also delay a reveal by altering that point of view's state of mind. Perhaps your character is exhausted, or they're drunk, or they're distracted, or as in this example, they're in a highly emotionally and physically charged situation where they're processing lots of information, and so they're not devoting a whole lot of brain power to analytical conclusion. There's a reason why writing is an art and not a science, and that is trying to parse these things out, where knowing you have to reveal information, how to best reveal information, how you can delay information. Writing has rules, but it's up to you, the author, to think about how to best implement them and work within them, or sometimes break them, in order to tell the best story possible. So I'm going to delay talking about the second example as it also relates to the next tip. So once I've gotten through that one, I'll cut back in and we'll talk that one through as well. All right, back to the video. All right, tip 4 is my favorite tip. And this is that the third person limited point of view really gives you a great deal of flexibility on intensity. And this can really be effective and make for powerful stories. With the first person, since we are spending the entire story living in close proximity with that one character, the intensity tends to be very sharp and emotional. The third person, omniscient, on the other hand, since we are constantly jumping from one head to another willy-nilly, sometimes in the same sentence, certainly within the same paragraph, you cannot get that same level of emotional bonding, if you will, with a character to get that intensity. You're simply not there long enough, and you're looking at it from a much broader, wider perspective. Third person limited, you can have both, and that's what's really cool about it. Do you want to stay at arm's length from the character that you're with, kind of seeing their surface thoughts at a distance, observing the world as they observe it? That's fine. Do you want to dive in close and really feel every single thought and emotion that they're feeling with the same sharp intensity that they're experiencing it? You can do that too. And you can do that in the same novel. I personally love this close proximity. I think it makes stories feel much more real and alive. One of the best books I've read of this variety is John Steakley's Armor, which is military sci-fi set around a character in power armor, and he actually leaves his emotional engrams on this suit of power armor, and other characters then find it and are able to draw those experiences off of the suit. And so they even, along with you, are experiencing the intensity of this original character. And it's a really clever, a really powerful character story. I highly recommend it. But the power of this tip, as I said already, is you can do both the close in and the far out in the same story. You may have found, as I have, as you're writing a story, that there are some characters who are far more willing or unwilling to let you draw in close. If your protagonist is one of your major point of view characters, odds are they're going to be one of those where you can get very close in because you're spending probably a great deal of time with them, experiencing so much of the world through their eyes. But you may find that there are other perspectives that want to keep you at arm's length. This oftentimes could be the villain who doesn't want you to get that intimate with their schemes and their deeper, darker thoughts. Or it could be a much more private character who doesn't want to get close to others, or it may be somebody who holds a lot of secrets. As an example from my novel Tears from Iron, there is an enigmatic creature called the Shadow Servant who resists when I am telling the story from his point of view to some degree. He always holds me at arm's length and does not like to let me that far in. There is a character in my upcoming novel who is even more pronounced in this behavior. Such characters are compelling because of their mystery, but can seldom be your protagonist. You may have chuckled or raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the Shadow Servant resisting my attempts to go into his perspective, because of course he is a made-up character existing only in my own mind. But as you begin writing a story and telling a narrative, you will find that your characters probably do gain a degree of life of their own. And it is worth it to follow your gut instinct as you interact with those characters and figure out how best to portray them. That will help them feel more alive and more in the person of whoever they are. There's nothing wrong with jumping to their point of view if it's necessary or if it's useful, but there's nothing wrong also with holding them at a greater distance. It can be quite powerful. Some books do this in general, not just with one character, but with most or all of their characters. A perfect example of this is Jerry Pournelle and sometimes co-writer S.M. Sterling's series, Falkenberg's Legion, where the characters, especially in those books written only by Pournelle, are always held at some distance. And yet, interestingly enough, I would rank my two favorite sci-fi books as John Steakley's Very Intense Armor and Pournelle's much more standoffish Falkenberg's Legion. You could be incredibly successful with both methodologies or with them intertwined. Okay, here's Jonathan again from the edit, coming back to talk about the second example that I mentioned when I cut in at the end of recommendation number 3. And as you'll recall, I wanted to do that because this one relates to both number 3 and number 4. It relates to number 4 in the sense that this character's point of view that I'm talking about is the one I mentioned where he is a character who does not like letting anybody get close, and so he always holds me at arm's length when I'm writing, so you don't get very far into that point of view. The potential violation here is that in this circumstance, I never give his name, even when I'm inside of his head. He's known only as the Hunter. Now, I've already hinted at one of the reasons why I'm withholding information, and that is that he's not letting me in very close at all when I'm writing from his perspective. Yes, we're in his point of view, but it's a tenuous connection at best. It's talking on the radio where we got a little bit of static on the line, right? We see what he sees, we hear what he hears, but the thoughts going on inside of his head are much more filtered. We only see those surface thoughts, those surface emotions, and those deeper emotions that are so strong that he really can't hide them from us. Anything else is layered under his protective keep at arm's length. And that's the key here. The closer you get, the more information you have to impart. And for a second reason, just think about it. How often do you think about yourself by your own name? When I'm hungry, I don't think, Jonathan's hungry. I think, I'm hungry. Or probably more accurately, I don't even think in language at all. I just recognize the fact that I'm hungry. And that's just it. It's not common for us to think about ourselves by our own names at all. Remember that I mentioned when we first meet a character, it's customary to give maybe a little bit of backstory or a little bit of easing in as you get to know the character, just to sort of welcome the character reader into a point of view relationship. But that really can vary, and it depends a lot on how deep you go and how major of a character that particular individual is. And in the circumstance of the Hunter, there is no introduction at all. You just jump into his scene and go from the first beginnings of his current experiences. So ultimately, As I mentioned last cut-in, a lot of this comes down to interpretation and figuring out the best way to tell these stories. And while there are rules, they're all very gray with a lot of fuzz around the edge. It's important to understand them so you know how to work within them and how to sometimes violate them. All right, so that's it for my interruptions. Let's get back to the video. So while this tip is probably my favorite tip, because I really do enjoy playing with that intensity levels in the different perspectives. The next tip, tip number 5, is the reason for this video, what inspired this one, and then also, as I mentioned, the story thread one that I've already released. And that is figuring out whose head you should be in at any point in time to begin with. If we go with the assumption that your protagonist is going to be your key point of view character, then it naturally follows that anytime that protagonist is present in a scene, you will be spending it in their perspective. But don't be caught in this trap. You don't have to do it that way. Frequently, it probably is the best way to go, but if you get stuck in that, you may find that you're actually hurting your story in the long run. So when might you shift out of that perspective into another one? Obviously, if the protagonist is not present in the scene at all, then you're not going to tell it from them. That's an easy one. That's a freebie. But when the protagonist is present, you may want to convey something that the protagonist doesn't know or isn't aware of during that scene. Say, for example, the protagonist and antagonist are meeting, and the antagonist has something really nasty lined up for the protagonist that you want the reader to know about, but the protagonist doesn't see coming. If you're telling the story from the antagonist's perspective, you can unveil that to your reader. So later on, when your reader is back with the protagonist in their point of view, and they know there's bad things about to happen, they're at their edge of their seats waiting to see how it's going to unfold. Of course, sometimes you don't want the reader to know that. You want the reader to be surprised along with the protagonist. And in that case, you want to stay away from your antagonist and their plans. So in this example, it really depends on whether you want the reader to be aware of something the character doesn't know, or if you want the reader to be surprised along with the character. And these both can be powerful in different ways. They can really ramp up the tension and the intensity and the overall enjoyment of a story. Another time might be when an alternative point of view really allows you to develop your characterization, your plot, your themes in a much more profound way than you could get through your primary perspective. One example that comes to mind is also from my story, Tears from Iron. I'm jumping back to my own book because I think for this it's really helpful for me to talk about the decisions I'm making as a writer, as I'm thinking about the book that I'm trying to tell, and I can't really do that with somebody else's story. So anyway, I'm also going to try to tell this with as minimal spoilers as possible. But basically, late in the story, the protagonist, who is also the main point of view character, is captive. I won't say by whom, but he's held captive. And during his time in captivity, he encounters several other major characters in the story. Now, I could have told this entirely from his point of view. I've been spending most of the time, about 60% of the book is from his perspective. So I certainly could have spent more time in his perspective. But I fairly early on realized that his mental and emotional state was going to be pretty much the same with each of these other characters. The key part of those scenes was not what's happening in him, but the influence he's having on others. And the best way for me to show that was to jump out of that point of view, and I think all but one of those scenes, because in one I did want to show his mindset, but in the rest I wanted to leave that behind to experience it from the perspective of those who he is interacting with. And I think that made those scenes far more meaningful, certainly from a thematic point, but also from a character and plot point as well. This leads to another critical idea for this tip, and that is writer's block. I've done a previous video on writer's block where I discussed different kinds and different solutions, but while I was coming with those lists of solutions, one of those which slipped my mind is, in fact, this tip number 5 under points of view. And that is that sometimes maybe the reason you're stuck in a scene is because you're trying to tell it from the wrong perspective. Maybe it's coming out just woefully inadequate in your mind. It feels blah and lifeless and dead. Like with my protagonist who was held captive, writing from his perspective would have gotten dull really fast. Is there another perspective? Is there a way to flip it around to make it more interesting than the idea you had to begin with. Give it a try. You may find that you don't like it. You can scrap the effort and try again. But you may end up with one of the best scenes that you've ever written, restoring life to a story that was becoming dull and lifeless. Okay, so we have come to the end. To wrap up, let's briefly cover what we've talked about. So we started by just looking at the different kinds of point of view. I touched very briefly on the different perspectives. Then we went to the 5 tips. Tip number 1, if you are going to jump heads, make sure that you're very clear about when you do it. Either mark it with the 3 asterisks or add a chapter break. Tip number 2, also if you're going to hop heads, make sure that you establish that pattern fairly early on. Probably by chapter 3, 10,000 words, 15,000 words, somewhere in there, depending upon how long your chapters are. Start doing it early on. That way the reader gets comfortable with it. It becomes normal to them. So when you do it, it's not jarring. It doesn't ruin that immersion, especially at those critical moments where you want to keep them fully engaged in the story. Tip number 3, what the character sees, the reader sees. What the character knows, what the reader knows. Don't hold back those secrets. It just ticks off your readers and may make them put the book down and move on to something better. Tip number 4, you don't always have to have the same level of intensity with every point of view. With some characters, it may be great to dive in deep to feel that emotional intensity, while with other characters, there may be value in staying at arm's length to maintain that suspension, that air of mystery. Along the same lines, it's a good consideration for the whole novel to consider how deep you want to go overall. Do you want something more standoffish and analytical, like Parnell's Falkenberg's Legion? Or do you want something where the readers live through the blood, the sweat, and the tears, like Sneakley's Armor? And finally, tip number 5, don't feel locked into your protagonist's head every time the protagonist is in a scene. You can go to other characters and see those moments from a different perspective. Sometimes it may solve writer's block. Sometimes it may make those scenes far more powerful than you could have achieved by sticking with the primary point of view. So I hope you found these tips useful for your own writer's journey. If you're a reader, not a writer, hopefully you found them also interesting as pulling back those layers of what makes some stories so great and some stories maybe more lackluster. If you did enjoy it, please hit the like button, and also please subscribe for more of these videos that I'll be coming out with in the future. I've been doing a lot of videos on the writing process lately, but I do plan on branching out here pretty soon into some other fantasy delves into the nature of the genre itself. I'll also be sure to check out those videos I've already done on character arcs and on writer's block. I will have those linked down in the description below as promised. And of course, if you have any thoughts, I would always love to hear from you. Go ahead and put any thoughts you have on my tips. If you have other tips, other perspectives on how to make character point of view more powerful, please put those in the comments below. Thank you, and have a good day. This is why writing is easier than talking.